Good morning, everybody. I'm Ben Summers. I'm a director on the Microsoft 365 Copilot marketing team, and this is a session with a slightly shortened title. I think it was something longer originally, but now it's called Follow the Prompt. I will be joined later by my colleague Erica, who I will call up when we start doing demos. And I want to start this session off with what looks like a little bit of a legal disclaimer, but it's probably more of what I might call a marketing disclaimer. This session is really going to be about how Copilot prompts flow through our infrastructure and how responses come back to us. We're going to talk about how we keep things secure. We're going to talk about where you have control points to actually help you meet the specific needs of your organization. And we know, right, this is a pretty complex topic. We're not going to hit every single thing that needs to be hit here because there are so many systems involved. There's a sort of a vast array of things. And it's also a point in time, right? Copilot is still new. We are still doing a lot to work on the way that the infrastructure functions. And so we're going to tell you everything that we possibly can. In addition, everything that we're going to say here is about something that's either generally available or in public preview, which means that it's all documented. So the point here is not necessarily to shake you with new stuff. It's to bring everything together into one place. And at the end of this, what I'm going to do is present you with a sort of a slide that's a visual representation of everything that we talked about, as well as a link that accompanies it to every piece of documentation that you would need to actually see where we went from. So let's get going. In his keynote, you heard Satya talk about how every person would have a copilot and every business process would have an agent. And with this, he introduced this concept of the Copilot control system, built around this idea that you could have, governance and tooling to protect your data, controls that would help you actually manage your copilots and your agents, and of course, the reporting that you would need to measure business outcomes and business value. Now, while this presentation, I admit, is not actually explicitly about the Copilot control system, we're going to touch on a lot of its elements today, a lot of them. And we're going to do that in 45 minutes, so we kind of need to get rolling. And I will say that if there's any chance that we need to have Q&A afterwards, which I think is probably highly likely, we can talk over here, and I'll answer all the questions that I can. And I will be around on the hub floor as well later. OK, so we want to start with just, let's call it plain old Microsoft Copilot, right? When you look at this, right, this is the view that you get of Copilot when you're logged in with your Enter ID, but you don't actually have a Microsoft 365 Copilot license. You'll notice that at the top of that window, there's no web work toggle going on here, which many of you may have seen. And it can generate responses to your prompts based on the underlying model, the GPT-4o model, the training data that they used, and optionally, data that comes from the web, from our Bing search service. Now, when you've logged in with that Enter ID, the first thing that you need to know is that you get enterprise data protection. And what this means is EDP is really about the contractual commitments that we make in our product terms and our DPA, or our data processing agreement, or addendum, I should say. And it applies to everything that takes place within this Microsoft 365 service boundary that I've drawn up here on the slide. And what that's really saying is that, hey, we make these commitments. We secure your data physically and with best-in-class encryption. We keep your data private, right? We're data processors, and we handle it according to your requirements and your needs. We respect the access and governance controls that you put in place, so the policies, the labels, and the permissions, and we're going to go through all this as we go forward. We protect you against AI security and copyright risks. That's also something that we're going to detail about. And we do not, and we say this again and again, so we're going to say it again, we do not train your data on, we do not use your data to train our foundation models. So let's enter a prompt, since this is a Follow the Prompt series talk, a natural language query that we're going to direct at our LLM. We're going to take something that's very work appropriate. It's basically going to say, given the title, let's go with something seasonally appropriate. Copilot, please make a list of recommendations for work appropriate holiday gifts that cost under $25. So the first thing that's going to happen is the prompt is going to be passed to an orchestration service. And in this case, in this very simplified, sort of stylized view of Copilot architecture, we're going to evaluate the prompt. We're going to think about it in terms of tokens, right? Not natural language. That's sort of the way that we break this thing down. And we're going to decide based on the resources that we have available to us. And there are a lot of resources that the orchestrator has access to that we're going to process it in a specific way. We're going to decorate this prompt with effectively meta-prompting and make sure that it has a richer set of information than just this, so that when it goes to the LLM, it gets more information back. But we don't have access to any other additional information that might be further used to ground this prompt. We are only grounding it in the response that comes back from the LLM. Now, the other thing that the orchestrator does is it makes a call out to our responsible AI services. The responsible AI services are super, super important, right? Our AI principles govern how we design the Copilot service, and every single Microsoft AI project needs to have an associated impact assessment to determine its impact on people, on organizations, and actually society. And we actually offer extensive documentation on our AI practices in what's called the AI Transparency Report. And I will provide you with a link to that. It's a very excellent document, and I refer a lot of customers to it. The RAI services are providing you with not just filtering and content filtering, but they're actually also looking for harmful prompts. They're actually protecting you from prompt injection attacks and jailbreak attacks, and they're really looking for bad actors. We are really using this service both as we pass the prompt out to the LLM and as the response comes back to the LLM, which you're going to see later, to ensure that bad prompts never reach the LLM and that bad responses, because we know that AI is fallible, essentially, right, don't reach the end user. So, having passed the RAI check, the prompt is then sent down to the LLM. Orchestration checks are complete. You should know that we use multiple models to provide our services, and we try to optimize for the use case when we call those models. The models are not, they are provided by OpenAI and hosted entirely within our Azure service. They are not in any way, right, integrated or interoperable with the actual services operated by OpenAI. And the models themselves are subjected to rigorous security testing. So first by OpenAI before they bring the model to us, and then by a specific model red team here at Microsoft. And then additionally, we do pen testing both as a first-party service and a third-party service to make sure that these models are secure and properly tested before we deploy them. Now, it's also important to call out that as we process that prompt and provide you with a response, that we're not caching information that's sent to or from the LLM. It's effectively a stateless process. We don't retain a copy of your prompt once processing is complete, and the response is, and once that response is generated, that it disappears. So, having done that, we do another RAI check, as I mentioned. So we check it when it comes back in from the LLM, and if it passes, then once again that response is passed up to the user, and the user can then see both the prompt that they provided and the response generated by the LLM. Now, pause for a second just to consider everything that we've said. In this end-to-end process, within this boundary, we provide physical security, so that's actually checking who's in our data centers and that the data centers are hardened and secured. We provide virtual services, including server-side encryption at rest, server-side encryption in transit. If you're not happy with those and you want more, you can actually bring your own keys. There is, you can bring customer-managed encryption into our services. And finally, everything that we're doing is compliant with the National Institute of Standards and Technology's FIPS standard, that's 140.2. And so know that we are doing everything that we can throughout the infrastructure to make sure that that security obligation is met in accordance, again, with our enterprise data protection policies. Now, let's add something new. Let's add the Bing search service, right? This is a web query, right? What we just walked through is basically a response trained on LLM data. But the reality is that if you're giving gifts, you may want to have access to new pricing or new trends in gift giving or things like that. That LLM was probably built on data that was, I think it was October that the last model was trained, so it's about a year old, and a lot could have changed in a year. So you want to make sure that you have maybe current data to train this with. Now, the thing that I would point out on this diagram is that the Bing search service is an optional service, right? It's an optional connected experience by definition, And you'll see as we go through this that I put these little control point icons up onto the edges of the 365 service boundary to effectively say you can turn these things on and off. Now, the thing that's going to happen here when it leaves this Microsoft 365 service boundary is that the relationship that we have as data processor flips around. We become the data controller effectively. And the security terms, right, or the contractual terms that govern that change are actually the Microsoft Services Agreement and the Microsoft Privacy Statement, all completely documented. And the important thing to note here is we're talking about optional. We're talking about what you can do. You do not have to turn this on if you're not comfortable with the idea that you may need to bring web data into your enterprise environment. So let's talk about web search management for a little bit. Let's talk about that toggle. We want to talk about control points throughout this conversation. You should know, actually, that just in the past week, if you're not already painfully aware of this, you should know that we rolled out more granular controls, sort of this column here in the center, for web search enablement, which means that you can either enable web search in both Copilot and Microsoft 365 Copilot. You can disable it in both, or you can enable it only in the work context for the web. And those are basically all the configuration options that we understand that people want to be able to do. There may be additional, even more granular controls that we come up in the past and for in the future. We are absolutely open to feedback on that. And if you have feedback, add that to the Q&A afterwards, and we'll be happy to talk with you all. All right, let's keep going. I want to just click you through this, because the optional connected experiences configuration is actually done in config.office.com. And it's effectively a policy that you set. You can start by naming it and saying, hey, I want to allow web search in Copilot so that I can explain it to my audience here at Ignite. I can say that this configuration is going to actually apply to all users. You can see also that I can actually specify specific groups as well. And then I can go ahead and configure it. So I want to enable it. And then I have a drop-down that actually gives me the options that you saw on the previous slide. It's that simple. It's very, very easy to do. Once applied, let's just assume that I've opened that gate. I've now let a web query go out to the Bing search service. I get results back, right? Oh, wait. Huh. OK, I think we're going to pause here for a second. I tricked myself with my own slides. We get a prompt, and we get the results back from the orchestrator. Now, what just happened, right? We opened up access to the Bing web search query. And I want to be able to say I took that prompt, and what I wound up doing was the orchestrator just basically took the keywords out of that and generated an API query, right? We're not talking about natural language anymore. We're talking about an API query out to the Bing search service. So it's going to look for work-appropriate holiday gifts under $25. It does not take the entire prompt. It does not take entire files or summarized web pages. And it effectively anonymizes the query by taking all of the entry ID information off of it. And so that's a really important point to understand. It also doesn't impact a lot of the standard features of the Bing search service that you would anticipate that it might. So it's not affecting search ranking. It is not informing answers or social features. It really is kept entirely separate. And so you need to know that this is what is being done to a prompt when it's passed out to the search service. OK, so this is what I tricked myself into saying. So the prompt is then grounded with the web response and passed down to the LLM. From that point, the response goes back to the orchestrator and then back out to the end user. And you can see we logged it along the way. Now, you probably noticed, if you were sort of not just following my amazing PowerPoint animation skills, that there were a few things that we didn't log, right? So we don't offer visibility into the full web-grounded prompt. We only give you the prompt that was sent from the user to the orchestrator. There's a lot that we do with that prompt that we don't want to expose in terms of meta-prompting, so we don't give you that. And then you'll also notice that we are not actually explicitly going to log responses from the Bing search. Those responses are actually rolled up into the blue response, the all-up response. And actually what happens is that the orchestrator will take those links, for example, and use those to generate the citations from the public web that will actually be presented back to the user. So it's sort of an aggregation in the response of both the response from the LLM and the response from the Bing search service. OK. So we get a response back that tells us that there's a bunch of kind of interesting gifts that we can give for people for under $25. Everything from desk plants to stress relief toys. Okay, so now I'm going to invite Erica up on stage because it's not enough for me just to give you fancy animations and tell you that these things happen. With Purview, we can actually show you these things happening. So Erica, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. So in addition to the foundational controls that Ben just spoke about that Microsoft provides on the base platform, we also have controls we provide so you can have control of your data that you own. So, boom. So let's look at a couple of those transparencies and controls that you have. First, you can use retention and deletion policies to decide if these prompts even exist in your tenant long-term. Then we can use some new tools to do some analysis on those prompts to surface any potential risks so you can take action. This week, we announced the general availability of Data Security Posture Management for AI, which is here in our Microsoft Purview portal, which is similar to SharePoint Admin Center or any other admin center. Here, you can see things like reports on if there's any sensitive data that's been shared potentially in chats, unethical interactions, etc. But what I want to show you is the transparency that we provide around what the prompts and responses are, so you have full visibility into what's going on in your environment. Now, you do have to have a security role to see this information, so be sure so you can control who has access to this. So here in Activity Explorer, you can see some of the AI interactions that have happened over time. And if I click into one of those, in addition to some metadata, you can see the actual interaction details, such as the prompt that the user entered and the response. So in this case, I was summarizing a document, and the response was that summary. Additionally, you can search for very specific prompts and responses from a user in between certain date ranges, really quite extensive criteria using our eDiscovery tool. And here's an example of a prompt showing there. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Erica. All right. So that effectively gives you an overview of what you can do to see how information is flowing through Microsoft Copilot. Now let's make it a little more complicated. Let's add a few more things to it and talk about Microsoft 365 Copilot. Effectively, what happens when you now start paying for a license, right? Okay. So one of the things that I want to stress to everybody in the audience is that we understand that many of our customers have pretty complex requirements for the storage locations of their data, right? They may have purchased add-ons. I don't know if you guys all know about this, but they may have purchased add-ons like our multi-geo add-on or our advanced data residency add-on, because you have very specific requirements about how we should be storing your data at rest, right? You may need to have users assigned to specific geographies because of applicable laws and regulations, and you might even want even more granular control where it's not just a region, but it's a specific country, and we do give you these very, very granular controls. And in line with our obligation, because this sort of fits into our obligation as a data processor, we respect these tenant configurations and store your users' Copilot data accordingly, right? So something that we're going to look at a little bit later is where some of this content is actually being stored, not just within your tenant, but within the service within your tenant. And I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about that. Now, we make slightly different commitments about data processing, right? The data processing location or the location of the LLM processing is specifically what I'm talking about here. We do comply with applicable laws, and notably those of the EU. So in accordance with our EDP commitments, which I keep coming back to, we are processing data from the EU within the EU data boundary. In the rest of the world, we tend to process Copilot queries locally as often as possible, just for performance and laws of physics reasons. But there are exceptions that we will make based on necessity, effectively capacity, and performance. And so basically, if your data is in the EU, we're going to process it in the EU. In the rest of the world, we're going to try to process it as closely to your location as possible. And if we need to for load balancing reasons, et cetera, just as we would, frankly, with any other SaaS service, we do that. Okay, and then the final thing I wanted to talk just a little bit about, because this is another thing you get with with EDP and also with Copilot is the customer copyright commitment. A lot of people have questions about how we actually manage this. And I will tell you that the idea of this is not entirely new. I used to be in licensing, so I actually know that for a long time, we've offered some amount of indemnification from third-party claims. That's sort of a statement that we've made for quite a while. And this is sort of an extension of that that allows us to offer protection for AI-generated content and images. And it's important to understand that this is not a ticket to go do whatever you want. We consider this very much a shared commitment, right? So we insist, frankly, that customers can demonstrate that they didn't deliberately misuse or bypass the systems. And of course, we also want to make sure that the content, they didn't use any content that clearly knowingly violated copyright protections owned by other people. So it's a shared commitment, but it's one that we absolutely uphold, and it's very much in line with the commitments we've made for quite a while now as a company. Okay, let's get back to the prompting, right? That's the story here. What if I want to ask the question about gift giving in a slightly different way? And I want to make it relevant to work, right? Because this is not just about using Copilot for any old reason. This is about Copilot at work. I'm concerned that my gift should not violate corporate gift giving policy, something that many of us know a little bit about. I may not only know that, but I may also have the actual file on hand and say, like, can you look at this file and tell me that I'm not giving gifts that are in violation of a policy that I not only can reference, but I know exactly where it lives? Well, this is possibly because now with the Microsoft 365 Copilot, you get access to Copilot services through all the apps, right? The familiar apps that you use every day. But you're also now bringing in content from Microsoft Graph, which is all the data that's that's stored by your organization in SharePoint and OneDrive. And we also create an index of all that data, right? So a lot of you have heard about the semantic index, but the reality is our indexing is both lexical and semantic. So we're doing both semantic sort of vector representations of your data, as well as keyword, lexical keyword lookups of the data. And we do that to maximize relevancy across both of those, maximize the relevancy of the results that we return from our index as we RAG results. Okay, so let's move on. You can also, that's what I was going to say. So in addition to Microsoft Graph from a grounding resource perspective, you can also bring the Bing search service in. Now, the Graph, everything in there you'll notice is entirely within the 365 service boundary. I can also choose, optionally, to bring Bing in if I want to make sure that the results that I get are maximally grounded. So let's talk about what then winds up happening, okay? Prompt gets sent to the orchestrator. It's logged. Now I've got two queries that go out from the orchestrator. I get responses back, they come in. I now have a grounded response to the LLM. It's processed statelessly, it goes back to the orchestrator. We do a quick post-processing check. We dip back into the Graph after this, right? And then that response is returned all the way back to the user. And that is basically the flow. I think that you guys might have seen other, various versions of this, and I always thought, boy, it would be nice to animate this. So I thought I would do that. If anybody wants to see that again, maybe I can share the slides somewhere. But that's effectively the process. And you can see we've logged the prompt, we've logged both queries that went out, and we've logged the response. Once again, we're not logging those sort of interim, we're not logging that prompt past the orchestrator, and we're not logging some of those sort of interim responses, right? Okay. So you heard me talk a little bit earlier about where your data actually, about respecting your choices around where your data lives. Audit tools. So one of the things that we want to make sure that you have, in addition to the ability to understand where your data is going, is an ability to go look at it and audit it and do all the things that you as a company are required to do. So e-discovery, right? Retention policies. There are now separate retention policies for Copilot data, and communications compliance. And what you'll see, right, is that we are actually storing this data in effectively services that are entirely, bound to the same commitments. Ooh, what happened? My footer monitor just died. Okay, that effectively are, Exchange. You know exactly where that data is being stored. SharePoint and OneDrive libraries. You know exactly where those are. Your Copilot chat files. You know exactly where those are as well. And for Pages content, this is a little new. This is a SharePoint embedded service that we're actually using right here. But in all, we're basically keeping all the Copilot data that you have in known locations that you can have access to with the right permissions at a user level. Okay. Now, I also want to make sure that everybody knows that it's one thing to say that we can give you a bunch of canned reports, right? And that's a nice thing to have. But we have also heard from an awful lot of customers and also partners that they'd like to have access to an API that gives them the data that sits behind all these reports. All of that Copilot activity results, those are now coming to an API that will be in public preview by the end of the year. The API sits on the familiar graph endpoint, so it's a RESTful API that follows the same security practices, et cetera, as the rest of the Microsoft graph. And with public preview coming by the end of the year, people should start to be able to build their own bespoke reports and do their own kind of analysis on this data should they see fit. Okay. I'm going to bring Erica back up here in a second, because I want to move from just how data flows and how you can audit it to how you can prevent oversharing. And I'm not going to touch on this a lot, because I know that my colleague Alex Posen is going to do a show on oversharing just this afternoon. I don't want to steal his thunder. I just want to touch on this and say that there are two main ways that we recommend doing this. One is with SharePoint Access Management, which provides site-level management capabilities, and then the other is with Microsoft Purview, which is where we provide security governance and compliance around data and files. And I think these bolded words are very important for you guys to understand here. This is sort of how I think of the primary difference between these two things. Anyway, let's bring Erica back up on stage to demo how Microsoft Purview sensitivity labels can be used to protect content.
Perfect.
Erica?
Thanks, Ben. So in Microsoft Purview, we have a concept called sensitivity labels. And what those do is apply protections to your file that follow that file wherever it goes. This is, of course, done through encryption, and it can be used to enforce permissions on the files, as well as managing the actual access to the site. So let's look about how these sensitivity labels can also help protect your Copilot interactions. So here I have a confidential site about a merger that's upcoming, and I have a status report. If I look at the status report, you'll see that it has a sensitivity label called mergers and acquisitions, and this applies those protections I'm talking about. It can also do things like dynamic watermarking, which you can see I have done very loudly here so you can see it. But let's go ahead and work with this file in Copilot to see how it responds. So maybe that's a really long status report. I don't have time for that. So let's go ahead and summarize it. Copilot's going to look for the information and return it, saying with a summary. And you'll notice that it recognized that that document had a sensitivity label, and it automatically applied that label to the response, therefore protecting the content. The next thing I want to show you is a quick way to protect your files. So we oftentimes want to have a secure by default configuration, right? End users aren't experts, and we don't want to require them to remember all of our security policies. We just want to make it easy for them to do the right thing. So these labels do work in PowerPoint, Excel, Word, and of course also your email. You could manually choose the label that you'd like, and that's available in Business, Premium, and E3 license. Or if you have an E5 license, we can also apply automatic protections. So here I'm going to paste a credit card number, and in just a second, it's going to recognize that I did enter some sensitive information and suggest that I apply a certain sensitivity label. Also, if you want to be a bit more strict, you could enforce someone applying a sensitivity label. So here I'm going to put in Obsidian merger. And again, in just a second, you'll see almost immediately it recognized it was related to that merger and acquisition, and it applied the right label. So those are just some examples of the different levels of protection that you can have for your data. And we provide these options so you can decide how you want to enforce these protections. Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. So effectively, we're saying that, hey, even if you're taking files that are sensitive and summarizing them with Copilot or using Copilot to do them, you can sustain those sensitivity capabilities throughout your organization, whether you're working with it in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, or Outlook. And it means that it's very powerful. It's not allowing oversharing. Even if you have permissions, those those restrictions will persist as you move forward. All right. Now, with the remaining time that we have left, we're going to go into the next section, which is to say we've talked about Microsoft Copilot, which you can access with EDP, but without a license. We talked about Microsoft 365 Copilot, which you get with a license, and that you then get access to through all the different apps that you use, and then you also additionally get Microsoft Graph data. Now let's talk about Microsoft Graph as an extensible platform, because this is the third piece that we get a tremendous amount of questions about, right? And we're going to start to attempt to answer all the questions here. So I've redrawn the diagram just a little bit, right? I've moved the logs so that I can start illustrating, I think, how it is that the orchestration becomes even more complex as we move into this world of connectors and agents. And the first thing that I want to talk about is connecting to external data sources. Many of you at this point have probably heard about one of the easiest ways to do this, which is to build Microsoft Graph connectors or to connect existing first-party graph connectors into your tenant. They're easy to set up. They're configurable in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And when they're ingested, we create, again, both lexical and semantic indices of the data that you bring in. They are indexed. Everything is within the service boundary. So as you can see when we do this, bring your data in, bang, more animation, right? We index all that data within the service boundary. We are screening for sensitive data types because it's going to have to pass through the orchestrator at some point where we will do that. We will honor data access and permissions, right? And then everything that you do is being managed through the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. So again, it's external to the Microsoft 365 service boundary, and we offer a control point to make sure that if you want to turn that on or turn that off, you absolutely can. All right, so now what happens is you get the prompt flow, you go out, you get indexed data from there, it's augmented with queries. We're going to go through this whole flow. It's a little bit stylized, but it is something that you want to get used to seeing, which is to say you now have additional grounding data from your external sources indexed through Microsoft Graph and really behaving almost as a native part of Copilot at this point. And that's very interesting. Now, this is where it gets a little more interesting even. Now we're talking about agents, right? So ISV agents or LOB agents, things built by other people that you might want to run in your organization. So we provide a pretty, an agent in the simplest form, at least today, is an API paired with a manifest. And an agent interacts with Copilot is very similar, actually, to the way that the Bing search service operates. The agents that are available, we actually provide a pretty robust review of every application submitted for publication. And we have an app certification process that actually helps admins review the security and trustworthiness of the apps. Access, again, is controlled both through the catalog that's used to ingest it, but also through the admin center. And because data is flowing from these ISV and LOB apps through our orchestrator, we continue to provide those same services that allow us to govern the content that comes and goes from these applications. There's another point, though. You'll notice that the arrows on these are two ways, whereas the arrow on the Microsoft Graph connector is actually a one-way arrow. That's because we only ingest data in to the index. We don't bring data back out. Whereas with ISV and LOB agents, these are two-way communications lines, and these are much more in real time, right? Index data is usually scheduled, right? You may choose to update it every 5 minutes, or every day, or every 5 days. With an ISV agent or an LOB agent, those are basically APIs that you can call on demand. And then, just again, same thing. We're going to just show you now the flow. The query goes out to the agent. It's passing through the orchestrator where all the normal services are provided, right? So the orchestrator is going to make this choice to go to this agent, and the response comes back from that through that agent. All right. And then the final thing we want to point out is, whoops, I skipped a slide ahead, is that the Bing search service actually kind of fits in here too. We would say that the Bing search service is actually an external service bound by separate terms, something that sits outside of the Microsoft 365 service boundary. So that covers external data. And one thing that you're going to notice here, and I just want to keep pointing this out, is that at every point along this right-hand side of this Microsoft 365 service boundary, there's a control point. You have the ability to turn this on or turn this off. Okay, now let's go to the other side that everybody loves to talk about, which is, what about these Microsoft 365, what about these Microsoft Copilot Studio agents, right? The Copilot Studio actually sits within the Azure service boundary, which is to say that it's governed by those product terms and DPA, so really very, very similar in concept to the way that we govern the Microsoft 365 service boundary. It's just built on top of the Azure product terms, not the Microsoft 365 product terms. And that's effectively where the enterprise and LOB agents hosted within that service work. There are going to be exceptions if you are bringing third-party data through an agent, but the reality is that basically Copilot Studio is living there. We provide the same encryption for data at rest and in transit. We provide DLP controls, and we offer app management within the Power Platform Admin Center. So once again, right, a control point sitting outside of the Microsoft 365 service boundary, gating access, even to Microsoft's own cloud, right? So at every point around this, every service that we offer effectively has a control point that administrators can look at, and we offer security protections and contractual commitments around all of these things. All right. So now, again, just like everything else, the flow is very similar. I just want to make sure that everybody sees this because I worked hard on these animations, and I want to make sure that I don't waste any time. And so yes, so every one of these things, if governed properly, can be managed. All right, so let's do one more demo with Erica, and we're going to talk about Microsoft Copilot Studio and Microsoft Purview.
One of our goals with Microsoft is to provide the same level of transparency and control across all of our Copilots. And of course, that includes Copilot Studio. Actually, can you advance it as a video?
Yep.
So here is Copilot Studio. And I've built an agent for my team to automate one of our processes. And I've deployed it in Microsoft Teams. And what you're going to see in just a moment is that it's going to respect the permissions that people have to that content, even though it was built in Copilot Studio. So here's an employee asking the agent for help with a certain task, wondering about a project that he's working on. And because he has the proper permission, Copilot Studio will reply with that information. It has the sensitivity label associated with the response that you saw previously. And then next, we're going to look at an external vendor asking the same agent for help. In this case, they don't have access to Project Babylon because it's a very confidential project. So the agent respects that and declines to answer. And then also, of course, you will have the same level of analysis of risk on the prompts and responses in Copilot Studio agents and integrate that as a data source in all of our various dashboards and solutions that you saw previously.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Erica. All right, so let's bring it all together. This is sort of the total diagram. This is the one where you put your cameras up if you want to take a picture of this. There are no animations on this one, but I do want to say that you can see that the orchestrator has taken on an increasingly complex role as we've gone through this, right? So it's sort of the unsung hero in some ways of everything that we do. Fully fledged, it's more than just an LLM access through a web front end. This is a service that's richly integrated with all of Microsoft first party's apps. It is able to connect to all kinds of services that sit both within other parts of the Microsoft cloud as well as those that sit outside of it. We give you control points everywhere that there's a connection. So there shouldn't be a question as to whether or not you can turn off or turn on any of these things. And all of them have their own benefits that you need to weigh against the risks that you would assess from a security perspective in your organization. So this is, in my opinion, sort of the best way to think about how all of these things fit together. And the other thing about it is that everything that's here is documented. Everything is clearly laid out. And even though it all rests in sort of different parts of the Microsoft Learn documentation, et cetera, I have actually got everything pulled together into a single slide for you that I'm going to try to make available as quickly as possible for those of you that want to be able to see it. I also want to make this deck available to people as well. Before I go, I want to play a quick customer story. We've been working with BRK273 on their deployment of Microsoft 365 Copilot as well as apps. and I just want to hear from them. All right, let's see if we can get this thing to roll.
I'm an architect in Managing Copilot's IT infrastructure organization, and I'm working mainly on our digital workplace platform, which is mostly based on Microsoft 365. Managing Copilot is an almost 140-year-old family-owned pharmaceutical company located near Frankfurt, Germany. We started evaluating Microsoft 365 Copilot as part of the early adopter program, and now have a small but fairly active user community. We are still looking for areas that would benefit most from it and how we best position it in context of other solutions we have. Bringing a solution to an organization is all about reach and trust. In context of Copilot, I'd like to mention 3 important things for us. First, Copilot's enterprise data protection brings trust, and it has the same protection level of Microsoft 365 for all users, independent if they have Microsoft 365 Copilot already. Second, graph connectors. We have had some systems integrated already and double down on that. For graph connectors and graph in general, item-level permission trimming is crucial. We can trust that users see through Copilot nothing else than through the source system. Through the fundamentals coming from Microsoft Search, this is trusted, and with admin features like staged rollout, we can gain confidence through testing before releasing connector content to wider audiences. Third, teams, apps, and agents. At Boehringer, we have an extensive process vetting new providers and getting all the insights on information protection, data processing, security measures, etc., before introducing new solutions, which can be tedious. The new capability that Microsoft brings to Admin Center, allowing customers to view security and certification evidence for apps and agents provided by ISVs and validated by Microsoft, allows quicker adoption with confidence. We are continuously improving employee experience, but with broad and solid foundations we can rely on. We can get faster bringing improvements to our users to allow them to be productive and doing what they are best at, improving health.
Okay, let's wrap it up. So this is the slide that I referenced at the beginning. This is sort of a architecture diagram, but basically, let's see if my digital pointer works. Sort of, nope. So basically, if I took everything that I talked about in this talk today, I would arrange it like this. I would say, at the infrastructure level, the things in blue are the things that Microsoft does. The things in white are the things that we give you control points to manage. So, for example, we provide storage and security and transport, and we provide large language models in our Azure OpenAI service. We give you control over the geographic location of your data at rest. We give you control over the ability to bring your own key for encryption. We give you admin controls, all those toggles around the outside of my diagram. PPAC, Mac, TAC, the Office config files. These admin controls are the places where you can effectively turn on and turn off all the services that might interact with your Microsoft 365 Copilot or your Microsoft Copilot. We provide data sources, right? We help you with your org data, we provide Microsoft Graph, we provide the Bing search service, but we give you multiple ways to set up policies as to how that data is managed and what happens to it when it may or may not leave the perimeter of the enterprise data protection ring, so to speak, right? We provide orchestration services to coordinate it all, as well as responsible AI services to coordinate and protect everything. And then we provide integration in all of our first-party apps as well as our web service. So that's effectively the way that this works. And then, as you can see, everything on here is numbered, and everything on the left-hand side corresponds to that number, and that's the public documentation link for everything about every one of those services. The idea, of course, is that, yes, these sit across a vast array of Microsoft sites, so can we bring all this together? I will give credit to my colleagues' sales team in India actually built the first version of this, and I thought it was such a great idea that I asked if I could steal it and modify it, which I did. And so this is not just my idea, this is an idea that came from colleagues that I want to make sure that they get credit. So hopefully they're watching. It was great, guys. All right, 55 seconds left. We timed this pretty well. The last thing you guys need to know about is there's a lot of other content that's been presented at this event. The one thing that I want to point out to you is that this last session on Friday, the one about prepare your data for Microsoft with new tools, that's actually going to be this afternoon. So Erica, remind me what time it's going to be?
It'll be at 1:15 in this room.
So 1:15 in this room, that's going to be a great session. That's our oversharing framework, a lot of really interesting stuff. If you went to a pre-day workshop on this, you'll see a lot of familiar content. Please attend that one, and please go back and watch all these other ones on demand. We talk about a lot of really, really interesting stuff. Okay, we're down to our final 10 seconds, so thank you everybody very much for being here on a snowy Thursday morning. Questions over here. Thank you.